Buenas tardes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas todas las personas que están acá en la sala y
Good
también
afternoon. Welcome everyone in the room and also those of you following us online. Thank you very much for your time. Welcome. Welcome again. Now we will begin this special session, which focuses basically on analyzing the midterm review of implementation of the Sendai Framework. In this session, we aim to reach several aims. The first one is to comment on the characteristics of the process. Second, we would like to review the main findings and recommendations arising from this. And these findings have been possible with the country-specific work. We will also comment on the different consultation fora that the process has created in order to be intersectional, cross-cutting, and inclusive. We have consulted with the civil society, the science and technology sector, the academia, the private sector. And finally, ensuring the gender perspective, the participation of young people and of people with disabilities. We will also exchange suggestions and key suggestions and recommendations arising from the national voluntary reviews that are specific, and we will address them later on. We will talk about why this midterm review is an opportunity, and also it provides the region with the opportunity to share its capacity and experience to share this globally. And finally, we will be getting inputs in order to update the regional action plan and to create a positioning document that the Americas and the Caribbean will send to the high-level meeting at the General Assembly that will be held in May of this year. I know these are ambitious purposes, of course, but I know we can do it. And why? Because today we have two major events, let's say. First of all, in the first section, we will hear about the main stakeholders of the process. Here we have Paola Albrito, who is the director of the UNDRR, and also Mark Gordon, who has been leading this midterm review process. They will be sharing this information with us. Unfortunately, they only have 10 minutes, but still they will be sharing what their findings in the process, the characteristics of the process, etc. And then in a second section, we will have the main participants, country representatives that will be sharing their findings with us here on stage, while they prepare the reports. So we believe that those sessions will enable us to listen to each other, and they are essential to help us achieve our aims. So without further ado, to give the floor to the main participants, first of all, I would like to give the floor to Paola so that she can talk to us. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Buenas tardes, Excellencies, ladies.
Good afternoon.
Indeed, we are at the midpoint of the Sendai Framework for Action implementation, with the clear indication that if we do not adopt a prevention-focused approach that integrates risk reduction in decision-making, we will not be able to sustain our future. The Secretary of the Presidency, Delgado, today, at the opening of the regional platform, provided a very clear insight on what this means in concrete terms. This message is being heard, and it has been very rewarding for UNDRR to see the uptake by member states and stakeholders in the midterm review of the Sendai Framework. And we're seeing as further evidence on how states and stakeholders are integrating the experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequences of climate breakdown by placing increasing priority to better understanding our relationship with risks. The official submission to the midterm review of the Sendai Framework have been very substantial. 72 countries will have submitted voluntary national reports for the midterm review by May, together with 28 organizations, funds, and programs of the United Nations system. 25 constituencies of the UNDRR stakeholders engagement mechanism, as well as submission from other major groups, organization, and constituency, and supplemented by global and regional thematic studies and interview. This is impressive, and it is particularly rewarding to see how many countries in this region have applied the guiding principles of the Sendai Framework of an all-of-society approach and engagement and leadership when applying this consultation process. This has created an enormous repository of information that can guide our action now and in the years to come. The publication of the report of the main findings and recommendation of the midterm review of the Sendai Framework on the 25th of February by the UN General Assembly marked an important shift from the substantive considerations and strategic review to the political process. A briefing of member states was convened by Australia and the Republic of Indonesia as co-facilitators of the intergovernmental process of the midterm review on the 14th of February this year at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. In this briefing, the co-facilitators referred to the mental process to develop a concise and action-oriented political declaration on the midterm review of the Sendai Framework to be adopted at the high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly on the midterm review. It's going to be convened by the President of the General Assembly on the 18th and 19th of May, 2023. The main findings and recommendations of the midterm review of the Sendai Framework were also presented at the briefings by the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Mami Mitsutori. And we've been very encouraged by the statements made by member states on the findings, particularly in respect of the recommendations for renovation to risk governance and risk management at all levels, reforms on how disaster risk is accounted for and priced in the global financial system, and preventive actions that must be prioritized in the public and private decision-making, investors, and behavior across all agenda, conventions, and framework. For the high-level meeting in May, the President of the General Assembly invites participation at the high-level meeting at the highest possible level. Many countries that have already confirmed their participation in New York, and we very much look forward to receiving confirmations of participation from this region. The high-level meetings, together with the Leadership Roundtable, the accompanying multi-stakeholder risk reduction and the SAI event that runs in parallel on the 17th and 19th of May, provide numerous opportunity for states and stakeholders' participation and contribution. Finally, the midterm review of the Sendai Framework will not have the impact required if the main findings and recommendations are not picked up and integrated within all other global stock-taking, review exercise and follow-up processes in 2023 and beyond. I will just mention a few. The midterm review of the Water Action Decade, the quadriennial review of the SDGs, the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement and COP28, the follow-up process to the Montreal Global Biodiversity Process, as well as the Samoa, Doha, Istanbul, and Vienna Program of Action, and of course, the Summit for the Future in 2024. Only when decision-making, investments, and behavior is truly risk-informed, we will be able to achieve the outcomes and goals of all the 2015 Agenda, Convention, and Framework. What we are discussing in this session is how to ensure that our future and future of our children will be resilient to disasters, therefore sustainable. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Paola. Gracias por este.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you for this summary and these clear ideas. One final reflection, as you have said, this is a process which will have a stronger impact and more sense if it is part of an international debate on development, investment, decision-making, and a global agenda where disaster risk reduction actively integrates. Now we will give Mark the floor so that he can tell us a little bit about his findings or our findings in this process. You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. Wonderful to have this opportunity to interact with you, but also to listen to you again today as we give an opportunity to unpack some of the incredibly rich material that we have received from you, the countries, and you, the stakeholders, into this midterm review process. You will, of course, be aware that numerous inputs have been provided through the process to try and help frame our thinking as we are at this crucial inflection point on the road to 2030. And of course, the entire midterm review process has been driven and informed by the aspects of the shift from managing disasters after the fact to managing risks ex ante before the shock takes place so that we can avoid these shocks. But of course, as you are all acutely aware, in paragraph 15, the broadened scope of hazards and risks with which intend, and of course have been made so apparent since the Sendai Framework was adopted in 2015, not least through the COVID-19 pandemic and the imminence of the climate crisis consequences. But importantly, and this was incredibly encouraging to see it being taken up by member states and stakeholders, the guiding principles of all of state institutions and all of society being the fundamental imperative for us to be able to fundamentally reduce risk. And of course, how that's integrated as the direction into risk-informed decision-making, investment and behavior. So I'm going to run through some of the main findings and recommendations that you, member states and stakeholders have brought forth in the midterm review process and which are captured in the report that was published last month by the General Assembly in New York and which informs the deliberations of member states as they agree on the political declaration that we expect to be adopted at the high-level meeting of the General Assembly in May. It was encouraging to see that the notions of how we address and how we treat the disaster risk reduction in seeking sustainable and resilient pathways, that this can no longer be treated as a standalone sector. It is an outcome, it is a process, it is a function of good decision-making, and this was coming through very clearly in many of the submissions we received. But fundamentally, and as we realize through, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, there must be clear risk governance arrangements that entail the responsibilities adopted by multiple authorities of state institutions, and so that we can really take this on board in every sector, in every discipline and every scale to prevent and reduce disaster risk. Moving away from this notion of a single entity responsibility to one that is truly adaptive, vertically and horizontally integrated, underpinned by robust legislative and regulatory frameworks. But very deeply, and this is, I think, important for us all to recognize, is how aspects of our choices in the financial system, within the macroeconomic policy, within development and climate finance, to name but a few, inadvertently at times continue to contribute to the creation of disaster risk rather than the opposite. And in part, that must come with how we reform and redress the global financial system so that we fundamentally accurately price, account for, and disclose disaster risk in all financial transactions. But equally interesting from states and stakeholders, the recognition of how we expand and deepen our understanding of our relationship with risk before it manifests as the shock or the disaster, and how our improving understanding of that through both scientific and other means can lead us to a more comprehensive understanding of how risk can be reduced in the long term. I will go through these relatively quickly because the findings, I think, are well mapped in both the summary report and in the forthcoming main report that will be published on the 31st of March of this year. But I suspect many of you will be unsurprised to see that our progress is somewhat under expectation. And though even if we have seen significant improvement in, for example, countries using the Sendai Framework monitor, or the number of countries that have established national disaster loss accounting systems, and that 99% of countries reported improvements in risk information and management, we are not need to be. There are multiple reasons for this, and the reports and the submissions go into these in detail. Many of these will be very familiar to you, both in terms of fundamentally the notions of governance and how that deals with complex, interconnected, and interdependent drivers of risk creation and propagation, but equally how we are able to integrate that into both collaboration and decision-making, and how that pans out in how finance is allocated, both in terms of explicit preventative expenditure, but also in capital writ large. And some of these points here in terms of regulatory and legislative arrangements, but equally how risk continues to be externalized in the financial system, driven by often a short-termist approach in how capital is managed and governance is organized, are deep, deep challenges that we are not confronted with only within the Sendai Framework community, but well beyond. So in terms of where states and stakeholders were trying to intimate we need to move, just in pursuing the outcome and goal of the Sendai Framework, but equally more broadly in terms of risk-informed, sustainable and regenerative development and decision-making, investment and behavior. And many of these are but a summary of the summary. So please reserve your judgment until you've been able to read the entire report that comes out in the end of March. But we are looking at aspects of how we can move, yes, in moving this shift from hazards into better understanding of vulnerability and exposure, but equally in terms of how existing information and data can be better shared across sectors, domains, and data systems, and within and among government agencies, and to and from non-state and state actors. And this will require significant investment in various data sharing infrastructure, improving risk databases and risk mapping at national levels. But member states consistently called for centralized bodies with adequate budgets and the capacity to conduct consultations with various stakeholders, as well as with improved accountabilities. And this notion of assigning task and responsibility and accountability permeates all of the priorities for action. And certainly there is a common call for the investment and support to capacity development to improve and monitor subsequent uptake in decision-making. But also to recognize that with improving technological capability, we have opportunities to build more comprehensive risk assessments and using such technologies or scenario planning exercises to be able to grapple with and address complex risks, such as those that we have seen in recent years. In terms of the governance architecture, I've touched upon these briefly already, but this notion of shared responsibilities is a very common flavor that is coming through, so that it is not seen as a single entity account responsibility to be able to pursue risk-informed decision-making, investment and behavior. And that require us looking at targeting and integrating sectors and institutions primarily responsible for driving risk creation and or its corollary, prevention and reduction. And that this notion of moving towards adaptive risk governance, which we have all observed, not least during the COVID-19 pandemic, as we have tried to organize how we collaborate, decide, and invest in a dynamically changing environment, the of ensuring that this adaptability across all scales allows for an adequate risk understanding from local to national to global and back down again. And that, of course, pulls strongly on those guiding principles that member states agreed in the Sendai Framework itself, of how we bring together all of state institutions and all of society in improving our understanding of risk and how we determine pathways forward. And that means multiple stakeholder engagements of the types we see here at the platform today, but of course also with women, children, youth, Indigenous persons, and persons with disabilities and older persons. The aspect of strategic foresight came through in a few of the submissions, which I think is worth mentioning here, which such approaches, when applied at global, national, or local levels, can assist in exploring possible futures and interconnected risks, rather than treating them separately in an artificial manner, and encouraging longer-term and broader system thinking. Guiding the kind of sustainability transformations that we are hearing are being pushed towards in multiple agendas, including around the 2030 agenda. This recommendation coming from the major group on science and technology, the report of which I believe will be launched tomorrow. But this convergence that we see in terms of policy, overcoming sectoral silos and developing new and integrated approaches that take into account the interactions and focus on the underlying drivers of risk being a common theme. I realize that I'm being told time is up, so I'm going to have to race through the last ones very quickly. In terms of the aspects of investing, certainly this would be featured already in today's discussions and will do throughout this platform. But we have seen increasing traction in this notion of how the financial sector itself must better account for and accurately price disaster risk, being more transparent in aspects of risk exposure, which can move into conversations that are already ongoing in multiple different domains around aspects of how risk is featured in the mandates of, for example, central banks and other financial regulatory authorities. I won't dwell, and I will skip perhaps quickly through this last slide where you can see that the distillation has done little justice to what needs to take place in regards of priority 4, but this notion of the bridge between the humanitarian development and peace building activities of how we can use disaster risk reduction and recovery moving forward is clearly a strong one. Perhaps if you'll indulge me, Ivan, just before I close and we hear more from member states who have come forth with all of these, allow us just to very quickly touch upon the call that the director made of how we optimize the impact of this opportune moment for us to be able to drive risk-informed decision-making across all agendas. And there are many, and it will only happen with member state support and with the support of stakeholders. It is a moment in time that we should not squander this opportunity, and I would implore you all to try to drive this in all your interactions across all your different counterparts, the different sectors and domains, so that we have a chance to connect them all through a risk-based discourse. And of course, the high-level meeting in May, which will be convened by the President of the General Assembly, in fact, one of the chaperones of the SDGs, a man called Shaba Korosi, so we are in good hands, will provide us with that opportunity through the political declaration itself. And the meeting itself, of course, provides opportunities both for member states and for stakeholders at the highest possible level. And I think we've been very encouraged by the enthusiasm and uptake at that very highest level, and would encourage other member states and stakeholders to participate similarly. But there are also numerous opportunities for participation in the official sessions. And you can see this is the Risk Reduction Hub, which will run in parallel to the high-level meeting itself, starting on the 17th of May. And you can see with the types of themes that are emerging, we would invite you all to express your interest to participate and to bring other representatives of that risk equation that may go well beyond our traditional disaster risk reduction community. And that opportunity is not limited to those sessions of the Risk Reduction Hub, but equally to leaders' roundtables, which will be co-chaired by member states, our invitation only, and we would invite you to contact the Secretariat if you wish to participate. And so, Ivan, I will stop there and invite any further questions.
Gracias, Mark. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Creo que Mark nos ha expuesto un proceso bastante claro.
So Mark has shared with us a clear process regarding the findings and specific recommendations regarding each priority within the Sendai Framework, and also the next steps that aimed to decision-making, future decision-making as countries, so that we can accelerate compliance with the Sendai Framework. I'm not going to summarize what Mark has said. He has been very clear and concise. So this is the end of the first part of the session. Thank you, Paola and Mark, for your comments, your insight. Thank you so very much.
Y bien, como comentábamos, vamos a entrar.
As I have said before, there will be now a second section of this session, and we have with us country representatives. They have made this effort because, and they have worked hard in their own countries in order to prepare the voluntary reviews. Once again, I'm sorry that we have such little time, but of course it's great to listen to every country, to know how they built all this, which was the consultation process, and also the results they have shared with the world. However, time is not on our side. So we will have just 5 minutes so that each country can share with us their main takeaways. We have an alphabetical order so that country representatives can take the floor and share with us the main takeaway messages. So let's do this alphabetically. I would like to ask the Argentinian representative, Mrs. Sabina Frederick, Chair of the White Helmets Commission. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be Argentina's voice. And I will be presenting my country's review. In the COVID-19 negative situation, the national authorities understood that the implementation of the Sendai Framework 2015-2030 allowed us to evaluate our situation, identify problems, and identify challenges in a complex situation. Argentina included this review in the National Information Strengthening System, which was necessary to manage in a planned way the building of more resilient communities and regions. They should also be better prepared and less vulnerable, because we want to promote sustainable development. We take a note of the resources available, vulnerabilities, mistakes, and lessons learned. Among the main significant achievements is the adoption of a bill of law that creates a risk management system and also a system that protects civilians, SINAGIR. And this is done to shape the system. Also, we created a network of scientific systems to manage risk, disaster risk. This has been essential for the governance of risks in our country. The Secretariat of National Security now leads the SINAGIR, and Silvia de Rufo heads it. She's here today. We improved the emergency monitoring system It monitors every event by helping national and regional authorities. They provide information and they can enter the web portal. The National Meteorological System in 2020 implemented a new early warning system available 24 hours, 365 days a year. It provides graphic information for the population on meteorological trends and monitoring. We also included the gender perspective and the different vulnerability expressions. In the annual operational plan for risk management 2022, for the first time, we created a gender and diversity technical committee and a disability committee. Faced with the Sendai Framework priorities, we would like to highlight the consultation process that led to developing the National Plan for Disaster Risk Reduction 2018-2023. Priority 1, to understand risk. From the plan, we have the annual operational plans to comprehensively manage risk. The aim is to address risk in an integrated way in vulnerable areas. In different types of projects. As an international focal point, White Helmets was responsible for disseminating this information about the Sendai Framework and developing resilience locally before different types of governments, organizations, and institutions. We also implemented the environmental volunteering program for the sustainable management and conservation of natural resources in vulnerable communities aimed to climate change. In order to strengthen governance and disaster risk and the creation of the SINAGIR in 2016, in 2022, we created the Argentinian Agency for White Helmets. They work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and they aim to develop a policy regarding coordination and humanitarian aid. Also, we created the National Center for Risk Reduction, Disaster Risk Reduction with the Ministry of Defense and also the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, and the National Registry of Popular Neighborhoods. Regarding priority 3, investment for resilience, we created a national emergency fund and a national fund for risk FUNGIR under the SINAGIR. Regarding priority 4, preparation for the case of disasters, we created a department to manage fires. We also approved the National Capacity Department for Collapsed Structures. One of the accredited teams has just returned from the area that has impacted the area the most. We created the National Disaster Evaluation Team. Finally, progress in Argentina have meant that we have strengthened governance, we have applied strategies to reduce the harm caused by disasters, and we have created an information and early warning system in the case of catastrophes. There's still a long way to go, but the state has responded to the pandemic, and this sets our path. We have been shown solidarity with our neighboring countries, and we have helped enabled access to vaccinations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a la señora Frederick. Pasamos
Thank you, Mrs. Frederick. Now we have Canada, Mrs. Stephanie Duran, General Director of Emergencies Program from Canada. Welcome.
First, let me express Canada's utmost appreciation to the government of Uruguay, the city of Punta del Este, and the UNDRR for hosting such a timely and important regional platform. We are all looking at a shift from merely managing disasters to an approach that emphasizes better understanding and mitigation of disaster risk. The necessity for all of us to change this course has never been so clear, as evidenced by the increasing frequency and intensity of disasters within Canada, across the region, and the world. The COVID-19 pandemic and impacts of climate change have illustrated the challenge of managing the increasing complexity of disaster risk with the interconnectedness and interdependencies of our social, political, economic, and environmental systems hindering effective response when disasters strike. To address this significant challenge, we must collectively scale up multi-sectoral action towards the implementation of the targets of the Sendai Framework. As we look to build resilience across Canada, it is important to emphasize that Indigenous communities are among those most impacted by emergencies due to their remote and coastal location, insufficient access to emergency services, and their dependence on natural ecosystems. To this end, all levels of government in Canada will continue to prioritize a meaningful dialogue with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to address their disaster risk reduction needs and emergency management priorities. Underlining these initiatives is a focus on championing the empowerment of women and girls, both in Canada and around the world. This is especially important in the area of disaster risk reduction, where elderly, children, women, Indigenous peoples, and racialized communities and persons with disabilities face a number of vulnerabilities. Canada is committed to continuing to develop a flexible and adaptable system for preparing and responding to disaster risks and increasing resilience and mitigation strategies to an increasing complex and evolving hazard and risk landscape. Inclusive governance, science-informed and evidence-based decision-making approaches to disaster risk management must be the path by which we accelerate action towards the implementation of the Sendai Framework. By considering the needs of our most vulnerable populations and working in close collaboration with our subnational governments, including Indigenous leadership at the table, we can ensure that it has the tools, the capabilities, and the information to be informed and prepared for disaster risk, thus creating a greater resiliency and adaptability to the changing environment. The government in Canada is also sponsoring both domestic and international initiatives. And just for an example, in September 2022, our Prime Minister announced $10 million to the Climate Risk Early Warning System initiative to support developing countries to impacts of disasters by improving their capacity to prepare for hazardous weather, water, and climate events. It is key to better anticipate various sources of exposure for the most vulnerable in society and ensure that proper mitigation, preparedness, and recovery plans are in place. We must continue to enhance cooperation and collaboration domestically and across the region. We applaud the Canadian efforts made to align climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction with collective efforts regionally and globally to meet the 2030 targets of the Sendai Framework. The inherent nature of transboundary risk with disaster impacts that cascade across borders necessitate increasing collaboration between all levels of government to ensure the safeguard of the security of all our peoples. The theme of this regional platform, science and technology, is exceedingly important. It will continue to be a cornerstone to the success of many areas of the Sendai Framework through 2030 and beyond. The interoperability of data and the integration of science and technology can be enhanced to strengthen collaboration between sectors and governments. Disaster risk communication can be made more effective to reach more people. For example, our Minister of Emergency Preparedness, Bill Blair, is working with Canada's Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Mona Niemer, who you heard in plenary panel 1. And our focus is to better integrate science into decision-making, improve the understanding of disaster risks, and support strategic investments in risk reduction. Canada is committed to making progress to implement the goals of the Sendai Framework, and we will continue to champion and regional cooperation, increase equity in DRR to reduce the impact of disasters on the most vulnerable population, and scientifically informed leadership to build resilience. I look forward to our next few days together, and thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a la señora Durán.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Duran. Now we have Costa Rica. We have Carlos Picado, he's the Chief the President of the National Risk Prevention Emergency Response Commission, Mr. Alejandro Picado. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to complain officially because it's very difficult to talk about this for 5 minutes. Sorry, his name was Carlos Picado. I've worked in this area for several years. And I was there when the Geogo framework was adopted. And also when we had the consultation process for the Sendai Framework. And I work with planning in my country as well. So I have so many things to tell you, and it's impossible to do so in 5 minutes. So I'm going to follow the questions the organization asked us in order to address some of these aspects. The first question that we are asked is how we can make recommendations in order to advance towards the implementation of the Sendai Framework. One observation, when you read the Sendai Framework, have a look at its structure. It's a complex document. It's difficult to understand and it's difficult to assimilate. But still, those of us who have worked in the area have tried to learn it, to learn from it, to understand it, and to assimilate it. But it hasn't been easy. I mean that we need to work in planning processes in order to structure national policies and also the subsequent monitoring process. And this is what the UN needs to do. The UN needs to help countries understand and assimilate the Sendai Framework focus and content. In my country, we believe that the monitoring and follow-up chapter of our process is the most important one. There we have key information to show if we are complying with the Sendai Framework or not. Not just saying that we should provide the UN with evidence. We need to show all this to our population because we're accountable before them. There's another element which is important. They ask us about the challenges. A major challenge we have to face has to do with accountability regarding the Sendai Framework. Countries are told this is the Sendai Framework, it's a country commitment, you need to comply with it. And the question in the country is, okay, who's responsible for this before the UN and before the population that all this should be complied with? And people say governments casually, but actually we need a government and governance structure and coordination processes to comply with this framework. A key element then regarding challenges is to identify those responsible. The Sendai Framework states that governments will be held responsible, but now they say that risk is a shared responsibility. This means that there are other stakeholders, the private sector, the civil society, that also need to coordinate their work. So this idea of responsibility in the national plan is important to understand. Finally, there is this message to take to the debate to be held in New York regarding this midterm review. So we should, bring along a message with us. We suggest that people should understand that whatever we want to do as a country in regarding the Sendai Framework should not in any way be considered as a commitment before the UN or before external agents that are assessing us. The Sendai Framework is relevant because it contributes to or helps solve or meet national needs when it comes to managing risk, adaptation processes, transformation processes, or development models. It's very important, and it needs to meet national priorities, not priorities set by international organizations. We need to understand this. The framework needs to help countries, actually, and that will be very positive in order to reach our other aims. So I'm talking about responsibility and the possibility of assimilating the content and depth of the risk reduction area in this regard. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al señor Picado.
Thank you, Mr. Picado. Now let's go on to Cuba. We have Major General Ramón Pardo Guerra, Chief of Staff, National Civil Defense. Welcome. The Cuban delegation welcomes this opportunity to participate in the 8th Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction with the coordination of the Republic of Uruguay and the UN Regional Office for Disaster Risk Reduction for Latin America and the Caribbean. Before going to our main topic in this section, I would like to speak on behalf of my delegation, and we regret what has happened to the countries of Turkey and Syria because of the lives lost and the harm caused by the serious earthquake on the 6th of February. Also, we would like to thank once again several countries, also the Coordination Office, the UN system in Cuba, and other stakeholders that have supported us after several disaster situations that took place in 2022. In the last few years, we have seen a huge increase in the impact of climate change and disasters, also regarding vulnerability and threats, in particular in developing countries. It is essential for us to understand how serious climate change impact is, also its consequences. We should continue promoting these actions in order to protect human lives, resources, the ecosystem, our countries, and to get ready for harder scenarios. Disaster risk reduction is essential in order to move towards sustainable development with the support of science and innovation. Disaster risk reduction requires multiple investments, advanced technology transfer and knowledge. So we need the contribution of state in this national scenario, and we also need international coordination, especially North-South cooperation, and also the financial commitments taken on by countries to help developing countries and more vulnerable countries. Cuba is a small country. It's a state island, a developing state island that has suffered a 60-year financial, economic lockdown by the United States. And this has become worse in the last few years. Despite this, we have managed to develop a national strategy for disaster risk reduction led by the National Civil Defense System. We aim to protect the lives of people regarding the disaster impact. And we have also helped Caribbean brothers under the South-South cooperation system. We have trained people with the Cuban tools and with the participation of the scientific community and the UN. Also, the Rescue Army from Latin America and the Caribbean, among other institutions. Cuba very recently became the presidency of the 70s meeting. Therefore, we would like to reinforce our intention to help member states, and especially small island states, especially regarding disaster risk reduction. We would like to consolidate our commitment with the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction 2015-2030 and its targets. Finally, it's an honor to report that the 11th Disaster Congress and the 7th Firefighters Conference. This will facilitate the exchange of good practices and experience among decision makers, employees, the civil society, and other relevant stakeholders. Hopefully, these meetings will be useful to strengthen cooperation among our countries. Once again, the countries in the region will always have the support of the Cuban people and government. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al General Pardo Guerra.
Thank you, General Pardo Guerra. Now we have Ecuador, Mr. Rodrigo Rosero, Deputy Director, Risk Management Secretariat. Thank you. Good afternoon. Ecuador is a country whose path is aligned with risk reduction strategies. Since between 1990 and 2000, the UN has designated this decade for risk reduction. We have worked with different institutions to gradually change from a reactive to a prospective approach. Then we implemented the Sendai Framework in Ecuador. We included this in our constitution. So risk reduction is now considered a public policy. We are fully aligned with the 2015-2030 Sendai Framework. In this regional space we're in, which addresses the main findings and recommendations in the implementation of the Sendai Framework, please allow me to share the key information that we have implemented. After this midterm review, Ecuador has shared several aspects. And there are many findings, so I would like to highlight our work in 3 pillars. Education. Education is the basis for the development of countries and for risk management. We have identified major advances in this regard. First of all, the training and creation of courses that have to do with disaster risk reduction. This means that we have professionals that are experts and that can support the comprehensive development of our country. In education, we must also say how different types of education include different types of activities in order to raise awareness from very early ages.
Para ser llevada a la reunión de alto nivel de la Asamblea de las Naciones Unidas, que implica que...
And here is the challenge before the US General Assembly. We need to remember that this risk is not just another subject. We need to respect the cross-cutting nature of risk reduction. So this should be included at every academic level. Pillar number 2. Remember that science and technology are running threads in this regard. In our midterm review, I must say that there has been some progress regarding the strengthening of technical and scientific institutions in order to favor monitoring. And then need to make better decisions. Also, it is clear to see, we can clearly see that the academia is improving its connections with the society to improve threat-related situations and also situations that have to do with vulnerability. This is why the academia has now become an essential topic in our country. As a country, we have a challenge, especially regarding what the UN has said, this call to diversify early warning systems. And also how we can have to protect scientific, technical, so that we can have scientific basis for early decision making, and also monitoring will allow us to save millions of lives. And also livelihood, essential elements, heritage elements, etc., with anticipation based on impact. The idea is that states can create protection and stability policies within their technical and scientific institutions, and also incentives for the academia. And to those who fulfill this main role, which is essential in disaster risk reduction. Also, this midterm review has shown how this has been managed in the territory through different types of governments when it comes to risk management. This means that these seeds are now blossoming, but the work done after this is even more serious. And here lies the recommendation and the challenge. We need to guarantee that each country has a national risk management system. Therefore, its governing agency should be solid enough to create national policies. And in this case, it should actually ensure systemic risk management by prioritizing reduction and recovery. And locally, I would like to
regional, se que cada estado para verdaderas políticas nacionales.
I would like to improve national policies so that this is done locally, depending on the territorial competencies. We need to depend on our legislative powers. Without policies, there is no effective or resilient management. And to close my position, I would like to say something else from an idealistic perspective. Risk reduction management needs to depend on states. International cooperation should complement this.
De nosotros, de los técnicos, de cada país que hemos venido a esta plataforma, a nombre de una nación, depende posicionar.
And also, we are responsible for positioning, for sending this message to our people. We need to make sure that we do everything we can. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor Rosero. Pasamos ahora a Guatemala a través del señor Oscar Estuardo Cosio, secretario ejecutivo de la
Now we have Mr. Oscar Estuardo Cosio, Executive Secretary, Disaster Reduction National Coordination Agency.
Muy buenas tardes. Quiero aprovechar la oportunidad para, en nombre del señor presidente de la República y la delegación guatemalteca y el pueblo de Guatemala.
Thank you on behalf of the Guatemalan people and government. Thank you to the government of the Republic of Uruguay. And thank you to the UNDRR authorities for organizing this event.
Con relación a las principales acciones en la línea del marco de Sendai.
Regarding the Sendai Framework implementation, we have a staged system regarding disaster risk reduction. This includes different types of debate, and this is a think tank in this regard. And it includes inputs from different levels through the territorial platforms that have to do with the different stakeholders within the country. I would also like to mention that in this effort, we now have 18 departmental coordinators and other types of coordination. In 2019, we created the strategy in order to have within municipalities risk management opportunities. This is a strategy that was adopted by our government policy within municipal authorities. Several instances have been created in this regard.
Legal, existe una iniciativa para que se hagan las reformas al Código Municipal. Adicionalmente, desde el año 2020 se han desarrollado actualizaciones a los principales instrumentos normativos del país. El proceso de actualización de la Política Nacional de Reducción de Desastres, la actualización de la herramienta Inform y adicionalmente la actualización del Plan Nacional de Respuesta y el Marco Nacional de Recuperación, que este marco es muy importante y tiene el respaldo del señor presidente de manera de poder planificar articuladamente con todas las instituciones del Ejecutivo para el desarrollo de los proyectos de recuperación. Para la elaboración de este informe, quiero comentarles de que se hizo un esfuerzo de una consulta a nivel nacional que contó con 4 modalidades. La realización de una plataforma nacional de diálogo con 55 representantes de sectores, entrevistas a expertos, encuestas a actores territoriales y validación con el área sustantiva de la Secretaría Ejecutiva de Conrea. Dicho informe analizó el contexto nacional del riesgo de desastres en los últimos 7 años, que incluye los principales desastres y emergencias que ha dejado pérdidas tanto de vidas humanas como en medios de vida. Estos abarcan desde el deslizamiento de Cambia al año 2015 hasta los ciclones tropicales del año 2022. Adicionalmente, se toma como referencia de actualización el informe GT que hablé en un inicio. Guatemala se encuentra en un nivel global con un índice de riesgo de 5.0 en una escala de 1. De los 340 municipios del país, 27 se encuentran en riesgo muy alto, 171 en riesgo alto, 113 en riesgo medio, 34 en bajo y 5 en muy bajo. De acuerdo a lo anteriormente descrito, se emiten las siguientes recomendaciones. Fortalecer el marco legal y normativo en reducción de riesgo de desastres, incrementar la inversión pública y privada para este tema, impulsar también información y sensibilización pública sobre el riesgo de desastres y su naturaleza sistémica, así como aplicar un informe de multiamenazas. Fortalecer la evaluación de la información y el entendimiento del riesgo, lo cual debe estructurar un consejo científico y un grupo asesor de ciencia y tecnología para apoyar el proceso de toma de decisiones a nivel del país y asimismo elaborar una agenda nacional de investigación. En relación a la gobernanza, consideramos que es importante ajustar las estrategias, marcos políticos, legislativos, normativos, organizativos y de inversión, así como promover la responsabilidad compartida entre los gobiernos locales, los sectores y todas las partes interesadas. Para incrementar las acciones prioritarias también en la parte de inversión, es importante la asignación de recursos, impulsar acciones sectoriales para reforzar la resiliencia empresarial e industrial, y ahí cobra importancia el Marco Nacional de Reducción de Riesgos, y en igual forma para la preparación, respuesta y reconstruir mejor, actualizar leyes con enfoque de naturaleza sistémica de riesgo, con carácter más normativo, coercitivo, y a la vez crear un plan nacional de preparación, que existen acciones, pero es importante incluirlas en este plan. Y finalmente, para fortalecer la colaboración, asociación y cooperación, se recomienda desarrollar iniciativas, alianzas nuevas y emergentes con la cooperación internacional, sector privado, y optimizar la coordinación de los gobiernos con las asociaciones para el desarrollo y comunidad internacional. Nos hace falta mucho por hacer, pero estamos en la mejor disposición de poderlo realizar con mucha fuerza. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias al señor Cosio. Pasamos ahora a México. Vamos a tener de manera virtual la participación de México a través del señor Enrique Guevara Ortiz, director general del Centro Nacional de Prevención de Desastres, CENAPRED. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes. Saludo respetuosa y fraternamente a las y los representantes de los gobiernos de nuestra región de las Américas y el Caribe, así como a las personas integrantes de los organismos nacionales e internacionales que nos damos cita hoy para intercambiar perspectivas, retos y buenas prácticas que lleven a la realidad la implementación del marco de Sendai. Actualmente, en concordancia con las valiosas lecciones compartidas en la comunidad internacional, entendemos en México que todo riesgo es sistémico y sus impactos se materializan a través de sectores y escalas, por lo cual resulta necesario sumar esfuerzos para romper con los hilos institucionales e intergubernamentales en aras de lograr un país sostenible, seguro y resiliente. Durante 2022, México generó un informe de medio término sobre la implementación del marco de Sendai con la participación de 30 agencias federales. Entre los hallazgos más importantes, destaca que el 70% de las dependencias manifestaron progresos en la implementación de acciones multisectoriales relativas a la comprensión del riesgo de desastres, considerando la realización de estudios, investigaciones, bases de datos estadísticos y la utilización de sistemas de información geográfica. Otro rubro en el que se declaran avances es en cuanto a las acciones de preparación y respuesta, donde el rasgo sobresaliente es el trabajo coordinado interinstitucional. Por otro lado, el informe ha hecho visible que algunas dependencias crearon un área específica encargada de trabajar en materia de gestión integral del riesgo de desastre, logrando esta transversalización. Por ejemplo, la Secretaría de Agricultura y Desarrollo Rural cuenta con la Dirección General de Gestión de Riesgos, que se encarga de fomentar la gestión de riesgos a fin de minimizarlos en el
the risk in the agricultural sector by means of the management, prevention, and administration and transfer of risks. Another area where advances were shown were systematic information records on the risk of disasters. As a supplement, we also would like to mention that several institutions of the public general administration continuously carry out risk evaluations on the infrastructure under their charge. An example is the Center of Control and Energy that, thanks to the constant evaluations of their infrastructure, have been able to detect failures and vulnerabilities in the electrical system and managing the proper working of it insofar as possible in normal conditions as well as disaster conditions. Mexico has also advanced in an important area, which is the transfer of risks. And in this regard, 43% of the divisions that have contributed information mentioned that they have insurance for the sector, including the movable goods. And besides this, additional to the financial instruments that Mexico has for the prevention, care, and reconstruction after the disaster. In order to expand these initiatives in the year 2022, a national strategy of integral risk for disasters has been created for a political and methodological approach for the integration of risk management in strategic sectors. The first objective was the creation this year, at the beginning of this year, of the National Committee for Prevention as the coordination mechanism of actions specifically for the prevention of risks and prevention of disasters. And the divisions and entities of the public federal administration have to carry these actions out, but especially implementing concrete actions along throughout the territory. We have also created a network of universities in risk mitigation and disaster mitigation for the professionals to receive their training in a transversal manner, to generate knowledge and understand the risk of disasters, especially when making decisions. So efforts are being made to strengthen and integrate the national system of alerts with major investments from the federal government. And also in process is the inclusion of topics of textbooks that are distributed throughout boys and girls in basic education in Mexico. We are also implementing a strategy for the local communities so to reinforce the communities' approach to disasters so that they can be trained for reduction of risk and also respond to risk in the case of emergencies or disasters. We also want to mention that the members of the committees, besides participating in the strengthening of the communication, organization, preparation, and local resilience, are based in principles of coordination, co-responsibility, and solidarity. These committees, many cases, receive resources from civil protection, and they have relevant information that enables them to reinforce their preventive capacities. The road is long, but with enthusiasm and hard work, we will continue advancing in the framework of Sendai to achieve the proposed objectives, and only that way can we increase the capacity so that they can in a sustainable and resilient environment without leaving anybody outside. Thank you very much. Mr. Guevara Ortiz. Now we have the participation of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Auerbach, the Officer of Planning and Development of the Office of Management, Risk and Prevention.
Thank you for the opportunity to contribute with this intervention on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago. In 2022, our country submitted a VNR looking at progress and next steps for the implementation of the Sendai Framework. A key highlight of this was the decision at the highest level of the Cabinet for the ratification of the Sendai Framework in 2020. To ensure this, the Cabinet further established the National Disaster Risk Reduction Platform in 2021, comprising of multi-sectoral, scientific and non-scientific representatives. Analysis of the governance framework to manage disaster risk indicated that there has been some improvement since the advent of Sendai Framework, although with some barriers. There are several policy and legislative instruments underway or developed. These instruments are in alignment with regional and global frameworks for the joint agenda. However, many of these remain draft instruments, thereby limiting their authority to drive DRR and climate change adaptation. Risk reduction and risk knowledge continues to be siloed by sectoral risk assessments, with the MTR highlighting there is a need for closing the data gaps through coherent risk assessments. Risk reduction and resilience financing continues to be the main barrier to the implementation of the Sendai Framework in Trinidad and Tobago. Notwithstanding, there have been steady public investments in DRR, in particular early warning systems and public alerting. Shock response and social protection mechanisms have also grown to address some of the underlying drivers of disaster risk. Public sector budget allocations and expenditures to address disaster risk, climate change adaptation, and environmental priorities have been significantly lower than other national developmental priorities in our Vision 2030. National, regional, and international partnerships continues to grow to support DRR in Trinidad and Tobago. However, there is a need to better integrate non-state actors such as the private sector, academia, the CSOs in the national DRR mechanism through formal mechanisms. Systematic risk management is requiring, and the underlying drivers of risk must be addressed. Ecosystem-based approaches must be applied, and a shift in the attitudes towards risk at the level of the individual, communities, businesses, local and central governments is required. Trinidad and Tobago stands a moderate chance in achieving the outcomes and goals of the Sendai Framework if the main barriers are addressed. However, with the climate change augmenting the risk profile in a considerable way, creating new and expanding existing disaster risks, the coherent agenda becomes even more critical. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Baksh. Y ahora pasamos a los Estados Unidos.
Now we go to the United States of America. Ms. Cynthia Spishak, the Social Administrator of the Office of Analysis of Policies and Programs for the Federal Agency for Handling of Risks, FEMA.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. It's great to be here with everybody. Thank you for the other member states' presentations, and I thank you for this opportunity to present. I also recognize I'm going last, and I will govern my time accordingly. The United States remains committed to the disaster risk reduction work and advancing the implementation of the Sendai Framework. Reflecting on the midterm review, I'd like to highlight three key and probably familiar themes that emerged through our process. I also think there's opportunities that we should highlight for the success of meeting our goals. The first one is equity, and this is about that concept of no one left behind. Specifically, we're acknowledging that disasters have disproportionate impacts on vulnerable communities, and we've recognized we've made progress on opportunities for data and information sharing, renewed focuses on whole of society engagement to better understand and address some of the challenges, and identifying and removing barriers to program access. Secondly, I want to talk about the impacts of concurrent disasters in the context of implementing the Sendai Framework and the impacts on our workforce. These compounding disasters place big demands on emergency managers and disaster risk reduction practitioners like ourselves. And I anticipate this will continue to test our capacity to accelerate or even meet some of our targets. We need to focus on our workforce, taking opportunities for training and readiness, and addressing burnout and mental health together. And then third, addressing climate change. We want to continue to invest in the climate resilience and risk assessments. For example, in the United States, the National Hurricane Center is more consistently and more accurately predicting the direction of storm and their impacts. And we're placing big investments, such as the administration's plan for Prepare, into addressing several of these climate adaptation and resilience challenges. We also want to keep advocating for and showing the value of shifting from reactive disaster spending to data-driven investments in community-based resilience. And lastly, we want to further incorporate climate resilience into the humanitarian assistance. Collaborations like these are invaluable for advancing that work. And then finally, in terms of opportunities and lessons learned, I just wanted to highlight a few that we want to be thinking about over the next 7 years. The first is reducing those barriers to preventing communities to be more resilient to their shocks. We want to improve communication with and engagement with stakeholders and partners. And then finally, promoting that open and free data sharing so that we can all be better informed and prepared across all levels. I think these will be critical to implementing the Sendai goals and achieving them. So I suspect many of these resonate with a lot of you, but I look forward to continuing this conversation as we prepare towards the May meeting and engage over the next several days. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, señora Spishak. Con su participación hemos concluido las intervenciones
We have completed the specific sessions from various nations. And in order to conclude this session, let me please highlight a few ideas. We do not aim this to be a summary of the vast riches that we have heard in these special sessions, but perhaps we just want to make a few remarks that might be useful to us. It's clear that this process of the half-period review in the framework of Sendai has been a participative and multi-sectorial process at the national level as well as the regional and global levels. Also, it's very clear that the main findings and recommendations have been the result of contributions from each nation. So when you refer to approaches, they are more regional or global in nature. Also, it's very clear that without the effort of the nations, we will not be able to find key recommendations towards the future in the period that is remaining for the compliance with the framework. But it would seem to be that we have to ask ourselves some questions in regards to strategic terms as to precisely what to do and what steps to take for the years that are remaining to fulfill the framework and accelerate its compliance. In this regard, we are going through a difficult time when technical revisions are showing that we must make a few more decisions, and these decisions may have on the side of the Americas and the Caribbean an excellent opportunity to have an effect at the global level based on the learnings and knowledge that has been achieved. Also, it's also very clear based on the sessions by these countries that we have to have a better understanding of the risk reduction and disaster reduction, but also we must encompass some topics where experience has been gained, but there have also been challenges based on the speech by each nation. And I would like to highlight very quickly, for instance, that there is a very clear idea that the risk of disasters and risk and disaster reduction is not just a sector, it's an integral part of a sustainable development approach, which can help to the major global decisions and national decisions for development. Also, the link amongst risk reduction and climate change represents an increase in possible disasters that are associated to those events. And we must approach and we must broach them immediately. That's very clear based on your interventions. But in regards to this, there are some topics which in particular you have highlighted. For instance, the need to reinforce governance through legislation, through institutional reinforcement and technical capabilities and training. We also must go further in depth in the design of planning and policies that would connect risk and disaster reduction with sustainable development and particularly with climate change. And it's very necessary to assume an approach of inclusion and intersectionality and gender perspective. And it's very
poner
important
atención sobre
to
los
pay
mecanismos de
attention
financiamiento
to
e
the
inversión,
funding mechanisms
tanto
for
público como privado,
investment, for
en materia
private
de
and
reducción
public
de riesgos de
investment
desastres,
to reduce
que
disasters
es
and risk.
también
And
importante
also,
poner
it's
un
important
énfasis
to
en el
place emphasis
aprendizaje
on
de la
the
ciencia y la
learning of
tecnología y
science and
cómo informa
technology
las
and the
decisiones
way how it
de reducción de
informs
riesgos de
major
desastres,
decisions in
que
disaster
el abordaje
mitigation.
sobre territorio
And the
en
approach
términos
of different
subnacionales
territories
y
in
locales
subnational
es
and local
fundamental
regions is
para la
fundamental
decisión que tomar hacia el
for
futuro,
decision making in the future,
que hay que
that
profundizar,
we must also
retomar y
go further in
conservar la
depth and
visión
we
de
must conserve
responsabilidad
the view of
compartida
responsibility
y
that
de
is shared
participación
and
multisectorial.
multi-sectorial
Por supuesto, hay muchísimas
participation.
ideas,
Of course, there are
pero
many
me
other
quedo
ideas, but
destacando estas.
I
Muchísimas
want to
gracias
highlight
por
these.
estar acá.
So thank you
Tanto
very
quienes
much for
han
being
estado
here.
presentes
For those of you
presencialmente,
who have been
como
here
quien
in
nos ha hecho
person,
el
as
favor
well as
de
those
conectarse
who have been
virtualmente.
kind enough
Gracias
to
a quienes
connect
han
virtually.
participado en
Thank you very much for those who have participated in this panel.